Hello, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about Romanticism. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so obviously this is not a romantic piece. This is a neoclassical piece, The Oath of the Hirati by David. And the reason that I'm showing you this is I want you to remember the setting into which Romanticism comes. Okay, so think about what we talked about with neoclassicism, how it's returned to classical or antiquity, right? And you have the valuing of virtue over things like narrative and decoration. And so again, what you're seeing here is valuing of patriotism over family and love, right? And how austere it is, and how moralizing this is. But if you remember, we saw how it evolved into the style of Napoleon, okay, until about 1815 or so. And we briefly discussed how opulent it has become, okay? So what we're going to look at now is called Romanticism. And the root word of Romanticism is romantic, but this is romantic with a capital R. This isn't like, oh, he bought me flowers, it was so romantic. This is something else, okay? So, let me move ahead just a smidge. So Romanticism is antithetical, or the opposite, of the Enlightenment. And it was originally a literary movement that then moved to include the visual arts. And so this is from the late 18th to the early 19th century. So, so it is coinciding with the French Revolution, okay? And basically, it is the favoring of emotion and intuition over reason. And so the feeling was that Enlightenment had led to a program of political and social reform that then led to the French Revolution in 1789. And this created a period of terror and war throughout the entire European continent until 1815. And this really served to undermine the idea that society could be improved by removing old and corrupt conventions. Okay, so this is a reaction to the Enlightenment and how rational and how logical it is. Remember how at the start of the last lecture, I showed you the picture of the philosopher and the orrery, right? And this emphasis on education and going back to the classical times and reviving the mindset of the classical times, etc. So for romantics, they believe that crucial areas of experience are neglected by the emotional mind. So your emotions, your feelings, even the concept of the scare quote primitive man, okay? And the importance of the individual, the personal, the subjective. So they saw the rapid economic development of the Industrial Revolution and everything that followed as a sign of man's lack of control over his own destiny. Okay, so you had people who had, for generations, led very similar lives, right? Like subsistence farming or craftsmen, right? So you didn't have any machines, and you would have to have a cobbler make your shoes, and you would have to see someone else to get, barrels to store grapes, or I don't know, I'm making all this up clearly. But everything was handmade, and that's the way it always had been. And then with the Industrial Revolution, you very quickly have this movement towards mechanization and factory-like experiences. You have a lot of machinery replacing humans, but then instead of having an individual craftsperson or maybe them and one or two apprentices creating work, you have these factories that are creating massive outputs of the same thing. Okay, and you have this crowding into urban areas. And this was very, very difficult life for the people who had to work it. And it was also ugly, okay? And I'll get into that a little bit when I talk about William Blake. But at this time, everything seemed to emphasize the helplessness of the individual confronted by fate. And so what we're going to see with Romanticism is there will be some overarching themes, different types, if you will, of Romanticism, but there is not one set thing that has to be followed in order for a work to be considered romantic. Okay, so Romanticism clutches at past traditions, evoking the Middle Ages. Others are interested in the primitivism or the primitive, so reevaluation of the natural world. There's also spiritualism and mysticism, right? So we are swinging back from neoclassical, away from a reaction to a rejection of the neoclassical. So Romanticism is more a set of mind than a set of traits, and it rejects the classical and moralizing subject matter of neoclassicism in favor of much more diverse sources. So one concept that comes up frequently is this idea of the sublime. So originally this was a mystical idea of supreme beauty, and it became a dynamic and powerful force. So some said that this was an experience based on fear. Others said it was divinely inspired, but this would be overpowering. I don't know if you've ever gone somewhere. So think of like the sequoias in California, right? These ancient, massive trees, and you stand next to them and you just feel dwarfed by them and you feel kind of insignificant, right? That is an experience with the sublime. And sublime also has religious overtones. And so we're going to see a lot of that in the landscapes. And the sublime is literary in origin. We also have the concept of the picturesque, which is visual. It's based on the idea of travel and promotes interest in the quaint and the old world and the irregular. And it serves to reinforce moral notions. But basically, Romanticism is opposing classical and academic art. So when we talked about French Baroque, I mentioned that the French had an academy by which they trained and ensured that all the art produced in France was up to certain standards. So this is a reaction against. This is where we start to see like the creative genius starting to come out more for romantic writers. So this is Keats and others. There was actually this valuing of the highs and lows of manic depressive disorder, for instance. So instead of trying to modulate the very high manic periods and then very low periods of depression, these mood swings would be valued because they're giving you a range of experiences and you feel things more deeply. So you can see how there's this movement away from pure logic, pure rationality, and more of this emphasis on feeling, right? So, as I mentioned before, there isn't a definable style in romantic art. It's more an attitude to form, themes, and subjects. And you have the tendencies of extremes. So you either have extreme attention to detail, or you have very painterly, so very loose brush strokes, very broad, etc. And you can see here that there really is a lot of emphasis on detail. Okay, but look how small these birds are, right? How small these trees become. So think of the concept of a single individual standing here and looking out and just being awestruck. Okay, so there's this concern with evoking a sensuous experience, spiritual transformation, or both. And color is often of significant interest, and it's used both for symbolic associations as well as explored for optical effects. And painting is seen by many as the quintessential romantic art, or like the thing for romantic art. So we're not going to see a lot of works on paper or sculpture or architecture at this time, because most of this is in painting. Okay, but nature is seen as a living entity, and I swear we will eventually move away from this painting, but I just want to give you like an overview of this style. So nature is a living entity. So landscape painting, remember how we talked about the hierarchy and you had history painting at the top and landscape painting was way down at the bottom? So nature is seen as a living entity and it comes up and it is as important as history painting to the Romantics. And again, harkening back to Rousseau, the philosopher, that man and society are best in a natural state. And so this is where we start to see the concept of direct observation of landscapes and painting en plein air, which means painting in the open air. And that's something that's going to be really important for the Impressionists too. So for landscapes, we often have either very dramatic and fantastical or else extremely detailed. But there is this search for the wild naturalism, okay? So this quest for the spiritual in nature. And this is truly a very widespread movement, much more so than what we have seen up until this point, excuse me. So we're going to start with, and this is not chronological, I apologize for that. It's kind of hard to organize and I went more with themes than timeline. But this is by Frederick Edwin Church, who's a member of the Hudson River School, and he is American. Okay, so you're going to see this in Germany and France and the US. So this is the most widespread in terms of the countries that Western art history covers. This is the most widespread that we've seen so far. And so the Hudson River School, and this is a place, it's America's first true artistic fraternity. And these are landscape painters based in New York City, and they like form as a group roughly 1850. And Frederick Church is seen as the father or founder of the school due to the inspiration that his work provided. And he is one of the most successful painters of this school. Okay, so here we see Twilight in the Wilderness from 1860 by Frederick Edwin Church. And again, right, this concept of the sublime. And I briefly mentioned that we would see Manifest Destiny coming up, and we're going to see that here. But there's this idea of America as being a wilderness, and it is there to be explored. And it's seen as being inhabited, and this is very prejudicial language. This is not something that I would say, but it is seen at the time as being inhabited by savages or uninhabited. Native Americans were not seen at the same level as people. And so there was this idea that this is untamed wilderness, even if it did have Native Americans living there, okay? So for the Hudson River School, we see an idealized naturalism, and we're going to be seeing a lot of en plein air painting. And after the Civil War, this school does die out. So 1864 is when the Civil War ends, and so we start to see it go downhill from there. And aesthetic shifts to France from Great Britain. So Frederick Edwin Church became famous for this painting, which is Niagara, painted in 1857. And you can see how overpowering this nature is. But there is this emphasis on salvation. So we do see some moralizing elements in some of these paintings. So this rainbow, okay, here it makes sense, but there is often placement of rainbows and spots that are perhaps a little incongruous. This painting is very large, and it was designed to make the viewer feel like they were standing right at the edge of Niagara Falls. Okay, and you can see how the water is immensely detailed. So Frederick Edwin Church is not someone who is painterly so much as highly detailed. Okay, so you can see the care that has gone into each of the waves and the foam and the spray. Okay. And again, right, this idea of mankind, humanity being small and insignificant, and nature being powerful and awe-inspiring, and often dominated by God. Okay, so you're going to see the aggrandizing or enlargement of nature and the shrinking of humanity. Just to kind of, so this is kind of like putting humanity in context, sort of, for these painters. So you can see here how small the ship is in comparison. And this is Aurora Borealis from 1865 by the same artist. Okay, this is Cotopaxi. There's a Cotopaxi in the DIA, so I would encourage you to see that if you haven't. So Frederick Edwin Church traveled. This is in Ecuador. It is a volcano, and you can see that he does depict some of the indigenous peoples here, but they are, again, diminished. They're dwarfed by the awe-inspiring landscape around them, right? This concept of the sublime. There are also romantic artists like John Constable, who is British, and this is earlier. This is the Haywain from 1821. This is a famous piece, and I'm including Constable because I want to show you that Romanticism takes many forms, right? We had the massive, massive landscapes of church, and with Constable, we have this idealizing, this romanticizing of rural. Okay, so like I was talking about with the Industrial Revolution, stepping away from urban and factories and industry and industrial smokestacks and the dirt and the grime and the soot, and going back to an agricultural lifestyle. And so you can see that he is depicted here, a wagon being pulled in a very rural sort of landscape, but it's not awe-inspiring. It's not wilderness. This is an agricultural scene. Interestingly, Constable is known for painting clouds, and his clouds are so accurate that they were used to classify various types of clouds scientifically. So that's pretty interesting. Okay, so Thomas Cole. This is another painter in the Hudson River School, and he has very dramatic forms and vigorous technique. And again, we see the concept of the sublime. So what we're looking at here is the oxbow, and this is from 1836. And so the oxbow has to do with this river shape. But you can see here, here's the artist painting. And you can see that cast in light, we have the civilizing influence of pioneers and American people of the United States of America spreading out. And then over here, we have storm and sky. And this is the part that has not yet been conquered and civilized by Americans, right? So this concept of manifest destiny. It is our destiny to go forth and tame the wilderness and make it into this harmonious, peaceful landscape like you see here. All right, so I'm just going to keep moving. Unfortunately, another member of the Hudson River School, this is Bierstadt. Again, right, nature is awe-inspiring. Caspar David Friedrich is German, and we're going to be seeing a few of his artworks, and he often has some moralizing element. So this is Abbey in the Oak, Among Oak Trees, 1809 to 1810. And what we're seeing here is a cemetery, and there's a funerary procession. Let me, so that thing doesn't pop up. There's a funerary procession in the front. But again, the idea is that mankind is dwarfed by nature. okay? And ruins have this very romantic quality, right? So this pointing back to the medieval time period, but that nature has subdued mankind's influence over the landscape. So you can see how there's a huge difference just between Friedrich and Saskia, Friedrich and Thomas Cole. Okay, so this is called Monk by the Sea, and we see the individual here just completely dominated by this landscape. Similar color to the waves, and he just completely blends in. So this is from 1808 to 1810. Okay, again, just to give you this idea of what Romanticism can look like. So we have the wild and untamed landscape again. We have the individual standing on a cliff and looking out into a sea of fog, right? So again, this emphasis on individuality and the fact that, sorry, Anastasia, individuality and being the lone surveyor and explorer of landscape. Okay, so more landscape. This is J.M.W. Turner, and Turner is one of those who is more painterly than he is incredibly detailed, and so you're going to see very loose forms and loose brush strokes. And what we're seeing here is the burning of the Houses of Parliament, 1834, and he does this many times. This is the burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons, 16 October 1834, again painted in 1835. And so you can see how the human elements of the landscape are dwarfed, and it is dwarfed by this natural force of fire. And you can see just how loose these brush strokes are. Okay, so this is called Rome burning, and this is not necessarily based on something that he saw, but rather his conception of it. And so you can see just how loosely he is depicting these elements. This is a really important piece called Slave Ship, or Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming. And this is by Turner, and this was created in 1840. And so again, right, we're seeing this ship that's being dominated by the forces of nature. And you can see how the romantic elements come into play. And everything is just hazy, and you can kind of feel the terror of the situation. But what's special about this piece is that Turner was an abolitionist. So he fought for the destruction or abolition of slavery. And so this piece is a particularly grisly and difficult piece. And what you see here is a ship. And the content in the foreground of the piece is enslaved people who are shackled and have been thrown overboard. So for slave ships, they would be insured, but the insurance would cover captured and entrapped people who were washed overboard, but it would not cover death from illness of these peoples who had been enslaved. And so it turned out to be more profitable for slavers to throw those who were ill overboard and claim that they had been swept off the boat for insurance purposes. And so this is a really, really disturbing depiction of these people who have been thrown overboard in the middle of a storm, both for insurance purposes, but also to help the ship not sink. And this is painted in an attempt to help people realize the horrors of slavery and slave ships. And it was very effective. So this is a very sobering piece, and it's actually quite small. I believe it's maybe a little bigger than it appears on my screen. Okay. So also Turner depicted not only things like abolition or themes of abolition, but he also depicted modernity. So modern, right? And what you see here is a train, and trains are relatively new at this time, right? You have the discovery of steam as a force or a power source. And this piece is from 1844 and called Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway. Okay, so you can see how this is very different from someone like Constable, who's going back into an agricultural setting away from modernity. And here, Turner is showing modernity overtaking the landscape. So a lot of different views. Okay, so we're going to be getting a little bit darker for the Romantic artworks at this point in time. So for portraiture, it takes on new dimensions at this time, and it's no longer just about depicting someone in a grand manner, depicting their wealth and everything that they own, for instance, and making them look super attractive, but it's about individualism and temperament. And so what we see here is the family of King Carlos IV of Spain by Goya in 1800. And you can see how he has taken a lot of effort to make these people individual, and they're not idealized, okay? She has a very weak chin and rather protruding eyes. His eyes are incredibly pale and he's quite thick. So you can see how these are really not idealized works at all. And Goya is the official court painter. And this is a slightly earlier portrait from 1795 to 98, portrait of the Matador, Pedro Romero. And so again, there's this emphasis on the individuality. You're not seeing his personal belongings or possessions behind him. But from what Goya is most known for, I should say, are his dark works. So I mentioned that there was going to be an interest in the medieval time period. And so we see that there is this desire to return to the medieval time period when you have this mysticism and religion that was overpowering, right? And people at this time were seen as more sincere, they were less educated, and this vein of medievalism, as it were, broke out and it becomes very popular. So this is not medievalism, but there is this fascination with these dark topics and times when humanity has not been at its best. So this is an Inquisition scene. And this is his very famous, the 3rd of May, 1808 in Madrid. And this is painted in 1814. And so what you see are basically peasants who rose up against the foreign individuals who tried to come in and rule over them. And we have this comparison here of this figure to almost a Christ-like pose. And we see the faceless menace here of these soldiers who are painted quite accurately. They're very angular, they're stiff, and the peasants are painted much more loosely. And so you can see that for Goya, his sympathies lie with the peasants, and they're being executed. And you see here the ranks of men being brought up to be executed as well, and they know what's coming. And so you see the terror on their faces. Here you don't even see their faces. And so you can see how Goya is really advocating for the peasants in this case. He has made them very sympathetic, and he's made the soldiers faceless, anonymous, and menacing. Okay, so Goya becomes quite dark, both in terms of subject matter and in terms of his palette. And he actually becomes very interested in mysticism and witchcraft. And so you see a lot of works like Witch's Flight here. And there is this fascination and preoccupation with witches and Satanism. But again, right, you can see how he's drawing these basically caricatures. They're not even human faces anymore. And so he has a lot to say about the state of humanity. And for those of you who may be wondering, Satan is often depicted as a goat, which is why you're going to see goats in the next few images. But again, right, very distorted caricatures, quite horrifying, very dark palette. Even when the palette is not so dark, okay, this is called Witch's Sabbath. And this is from the same time as the painting of the matador, the individual man who was kind of leaning. So you can see how his style progressed, but he was still interested in this subject matter even before his palette became so dark and his paints, his strokes so loose. Okay, so again, just really horrifying stuff. And we also have the sleep of reason produces monsters. And so this is the idea that reason and logic will turn to madness in dreams. Okay, so kind of horrifying. And he is also quite known for Saturn devouring his children, which is one of the black paintings. So pretty horrific. And there is also this emphasis on horror. So this is Jericho. And this piece is called The Raft of the Medusa, 1818, painted in 1818. And it has to do with a real life story of there was a Navy ship in France that had a captain who did not have the skill to do it. He was like a friend of a friend of someone important sort of thing. And so he was appointed captain, and the boat was not properly equipped, and it set sail in 1816 and it sank. And so basically, he and all the officers hop in the lifeboats and they jet off, and there are 150 people left with no lifeboats. And so they construct this raft, and they're on this raft for 13 days. And so what you see is the horror of this time. So way off in the distance, right here, let me see if I can zoom in on that. You can see a ship. And so what is going on here, yep, right there, is that these people are signaling the ship. And you can see the gamut of emotions, right? So again, this emphasis on humanity and emotions and the dark part of humanity, as well as nature. And it's a very sad story. The survivors were forced to resort to cannibalism after they'd been on this raft for so long. And of 150 people, only 10 survived. And again, right, you'll notice that it still has the formal elements, right? The triangular composition here, the diagonals, it is dynamic, it's engaging. And again, like artists that we have seen, Jericho spent a lot of time studying cadavers and dismembered body parts in order to paint this work. But another interesting point, and this is something that was shown in the music video with the Carters, is this work, right? You saw how massive it was. I believe Jay-Z was standing in front of it, and it zoomed in on this figure here. And this figure is the only non-white figure who is really emphasized. He's placed at the apex or the top of the triangle. And the reason for this is that Jericho was also an abolitionist. Okay, so he is elevating this non-white person and bringing attention to him. Okay, so Jericho, kind of grisly stuff. There's also this painting. He did a series of manias. So again, right, there's this idea that people are governed by certain elements in their brain. And so this is called Monomania, Portrait of an Excessively Jealous Woman. And so he went into asylums and he painted people there. But unlike what could have been done, what had been done in the past, he doesn't create a caricature. This is a very realistic depiction of this woman. And so even though she depicts a type, she is depicted with humanity and accuracy. And this piece is, again, you can see, right, like the aggrandizing, the broad gestures, the sweeping movements, but this piece is important because we're going to see it come up again with Kehinde Wiley. Delacroix, so this is Liberty Leading the People, July 28th, 1830. Excuse me. And so this is an uprising in Paris, and this is an embodiment of liberty, and she's leading all sorts of people. And again, you can see the carnage and the destruction of war, but the fact that this uprising is more important than that. And Delacroix also liked to paint very dramatic subjects. So when we see people depicted in many of these romantic works, we're going to see a lot of sinuous gestures, so kind of like S shapes and arabesques. We're going to see a lot of swooning women and exoticism. And I'm going to get into exoticism in the next lecture, which will be short, I swear, on Orientalism. Okay, so this is Massacre at Chios. Not sure I'm saying that right. But again, right, this sympathy for the underdogs who are being downtrodden, etc. And this is just to show you Ingres, who we saw in the neoclassical lecture, right, who also had sinuous forms and exoticism and nude women. But you can really feel the difference between Ingres and Delacroix. And this is the death of Sardanapalus. So this is a poem. It's based on a poem by Lord Byron, who's a romantic artist. And so Sardanapalus is this ruler in the East. And so he sees that he's about to be conquered, and so he has all of his concubines and his wives and his favorite horses and slaves brought into the same room and slaughtered before him before he takes his own life, so that none of them will be in service of the conquerors or debased by the conquerors. And so, again, this is a very romantic subject matter. So I hope you're kind of getting the idea of what romantic means. This is a Fuseli. This is actually in the DIA. This is called The Nightmare. So again, we have this very dramatic sweep of the woman, and she's swooning. And even the bed sheets are very sinuous. She's very languid and pale. And so you see the depiction of a mare here, which is a word for horse, but it's very ghostly and eerie. And then here we have, I believe it's an incubus. I mix incubus and succubus up. So this is a demon that would visit women in their sleep and paralyze them and impregnate them. And a succubus is the female version who would visit men in their dreams. Okay, so again, we just have these very sinuous, elegant, elongated forms. So thinking about it, the description is somewhat similar to mannerism, but hopefully you can see that it's quite different in terms of content and intent and depiction. Okay, so lastly, just wanted to briefly mention that we have visionary artists as well. And so these are creative geniuses, right? Highly individualistic art is being produced, and belief in the importance of personal vision, critique of the rational, reactions to the political uncertainties of the period. And William Blake is an incredibly famous poet as well, author. And he was very preoccupied with the plight of the downtrodden, so the less fortunate. And he would write about things like chimney sweeps. So at the time, right, you don't have central heating, and so you would have a fireplace, and that smoke has to go somewhere, so it goes up a chimney. But you're using your fireplace a lot. You can see how the chimney would get clogged. And in order to unclog, let's see if I'm remembering, yes, in order to unclog these chimneys, you would have someone go up and clean them. And the best possible person to clean a chimney was someone very small. And so you would have boys as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, and they wouldn't even wear any clothing because that could get stuck on the chimneys, and they would scrabble through the chimneys and clean them. And this is something that was extremely dangerous, and these children were often dead by the age of 10 because breathing in all this soot. And this was just the way that it was. So this is from 1908, and this is by Lewis Hine. And he went around and um, he said that he was just documenting factories, but really he was helping to document child labor, which helped pass child labor laws. And so what you see here are little girls. I'm guessing they're probably 6, 7 years old, and they work in a factory, okay? And so there is not this idea that children need to go to school and be protected. Children were put to work very young, and these factories were immensely dangerous. You could get your clothing caught in the machines. And the reason that they really, I'm trying to see if we have any other good shots that would help illustrate my point. But one of the reasons that they really like children in factories is because they have such small little fingers. And so they can reach into the parts and fix, like tie threads that break. And if they lose a finger or a hand, that's okay. Children are replaceable. No big deal. There's no workers' insurance. You're looking at like 12, 14-hour days, 6 days a week. And so this is what life is like for the industrial poor. Okay, and so we see this is what people like Constable were reacting to, moving away from the industrial. Okay, here you see child cotton pickers, and so children were being put to work, and the adults, their plight was no better. All right, so this is something that Blake is very passionate about. But the art that he's most well known for is based on his own conception of a world. So if you're familiar at all with Lord of the Rings, to me, he kind of is like J.R.R. Tolkien in coming up with this own world, this own very creative world with its own gods and geography and all sorts of things. So this is called The Ancient of Days from 1824. And you can see here that it is God drawing out the world. And he creates these really fantastical images. So when we say visionary, it means someone who sees things that others don't and depicts them. So not necessarily hallucinations, but is able to envision these things that are really fantastical and that others might not think of. And so what you see here is the great red dragon and the woman clothed in sun. And a lot of these works tie in some way to Revelations, the last book of the Bible, right? About the apocalypse and the downfall of man and the beast, okay? This is called The Ghost of a Flea from 1819 to 1820. And so think about a flea and blood sucking. And so he's really gets into like these really kind of grisly depictions that are very interesting. And so this is the creation of Adam, but in his own mythology. And so you can kind of see how this work is like nothing that we've seen. It is incredibly individual and unique. This is Nebuchadnezzar. Long story. If you're interested, I can fill you in, but it is a biblical thing. Okay, so again, and then I wanted to end with this sculpture. And so, as I mentioned, most of Romanticism is focused on painting, but we do see a little bit of the graphic arts, right? So like works on paper, drawing, printmaking, etc. And you have new techniques that are being produced because of something like the Industrial Revolution. So you have new mechanization, new ways of mass producing. Okay, and so this allows you to cater to a mass audience, as well as political caricatures. But with sculpture, there's very little impact until 1830. And so it was seen by many romantics as quintessentially classical, so concerned primarily with form and not with the content and the drama. Okay, so in the 1820s, we start to see this movement towards Romanticism in sculpture. And so what we see here is Ugolino and his sons. And this is someone who is mentioned in Dante's Inferno. And he is condemned to hell with his children, and they're starving. And his children are so distraught at seeing him he's turning in on himself, and his anxiety is just eating away at him. And you can see this on his face. And so his children ask him to eat them. So it's really a very barbaric story. And you can see how tortured he is, right? And you can kind of see how some of this relates back to something like Laocoon and his sons. But it is very individualistic. We have very rough surfaces, and it's very, very emotional. And you can see just like the figures seem to be holding tension within them, and like they could burst into movement at any time. And so that's what we're seeing here. And with that, I am going to draw Romanticism to a close. So hopefully you can understand how this is so completely different from the neoclassical. And I hope that you're finding it interesting to see how the pendulum swings one way and then the other, often in reaction to the previous style. So okie doke, thanks, bye.